Hi everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Patti Playfair. I am the past president of WFFA, and since we're not able to all meet out in the field, I thought I'd bring the field to you. I've been out in our forest noticing we're having some forest health issues, and so what's a landowner to do? We phone a friend, or three. So we're going to cover a little bit of what we're seeing out here in our larch plantation. And we're going to start with Randy Burke, who's with the DNR. He's a landowner assistance forester. And we're going to talk about what has killed our tree. So, Randy, what are you finding?
So down here in the larch, there's a couple different issues going on. A lot of them have needle cast, needle blight going on, but when we came up on these trees, they just look a lot different. A lot of times with the needle cast and needle blight, you see kind of that yellowish to orangish color as the needles die, but this one is more brown, and it's throughout the entire tree, not just scattered, which is what led Patti and her dad to realize something else was going on here. And so what is going on in this tree is Armillaria root disease. And the Armillaria is killing the entire tree and not just the needles. And so cutting into the base of the tree, you see the actual mycelial fan from the Armillaria root disease. It's kind of the thick leathery layer that you can peel off. And it'll be just under the bark there where you see that mycelial fan. And right next to it there's another tree. Looks like it's been dead a little bit longer, but guessing there's probably some Armillaria in this one as well. And there's some of the mycelial fan as well.
So Randy, how long will that fungal infection live on that dead wood? Or maybe Melissa knows.
I don't know the answer to that, how long. It eventually, you know, the source of food that the Armillaria is feeding on will run out as that tree decays, so it depends on how long it takes for the tree to decay. But it will remain on this site for inside the roots and underground for a very long time.
Yeah. And like I was saying to the group before, we know we've had very aggressive Armillaria root rot on this site for many years that we've been treating. It not only affects, of course, our Douglas fir and the grand fir, but is also virulent enough to kill larch, which generally aren't susceptible, and also ponderosa pine. So we know that it's on this site, and we're just going to have to figure out how to sort of live with it.
So one other thing that we had noticed in this young larch, outside of just the entire tree turning brown and dying, is the amount of cones produced on this young of a tree is not typical. So looking at that, one thing that's really common that we see in young Douglas fir that's attacked by Armillaria root disease is what we call a stress cone crop. So the Armillaria root disease is weakening and killing the tree, and so the tree puts out a whole bunch of cones to try and proliferate, produce seed before it dies. And so that's one other indicator in this tree that maybe something else was going on other than just the needle cast or the needle blight.
One of the other things we came out here to showcase was this needle cast disease, or needle cast problem we have going on. And that's why we asked Melissa Fisher to come out. She is also with the DNR, and she is, what's your official title, Melissa?
It's forest entomologist.
Hey, forest entomologist. She's all about bugs and crud.
Okay, so in this larch, we're seeing Armillaria, which is a type of needle cast, a fungus that affects the needles. And we can tell this is needle casts, Armillaria, because of the striping in the needles. You can see that not every needle in each whorl is affected, and of the ones that are infected, there's a pattern of green, yellow, and brown striping, basically. In some cases here, you can kind of see these speckled patterns. So there's also two other issues in larch that look very similar. One is hyperdermellilarisis, and that is needle blight. And needle blight affects the entire whorl. So the entire whorl will change color and defoliate. And another issue affecting needles is larch case bearer, and that is an invasive insect that basically hollows out the needles as it's feeding. And you'll see this occur in early spring. The needles will begin to look straw-like, and when you look at them closely, you'll see that they're hollowed out. And all three issues will defoliate larch, and it does look pretty bad from afar. But in general, if the tree is just infected for a year or two, it doesn't really cause too much harm to the tree. And one of the reasons why is because larch will defoliate naturally every fall anyway. It's going to lose all its needles, and then it's going to reflush in the spring. Additionally, larch will reflush in the summertime as well. So we have the initial flush in the spring when it breaks bud, but then later on in the summer it will flush again. So we often see issues like this in larch, but they don't usually cause too many problems. If it continues occurring year after year, you will begin to see a reduction in growth, because obviously this tree is not capable of photosynthesizing as much as it should be. And over time, if it were to continue, it is possible that the tree could die. You might see the top die at first, but then over time the entire tree might succumb. But these sort of issues don't often occur year after year. This is probably due to the fact that we had a really moist spring. We often see foliar issues in trees when we have moist springs and moist falls, when the spores for these foliar pathogens are moving around. The more humid it is in the stand, the more likely you're going to have issues with foliar pathogens. So this is one of the reasons why you would want to thin out your stands, to allow the air to flow in between the trees, and also pruning the lower branches might be helpful as well. As far as larch case bearer goes, there's not really management silviculturally that will help. There are two parasitoids that were released in the 60s to control larch case bearer, and it does seem like those parasitoids are doing a pretty good job. When I've collected pupa cases from larch that were infected with larch case bearer, I found that like 90% of the pupal cases, when they emerged, ended up being the parasitoid and not the case bearer. So that's a really good sign that we're getting some sort of control over that species.
So Melissa, looking just down here, the top out of that larch looks like it has lost almost all of its needles. Are we worried about that being top dieback? Or is that just the needle cast being more prominent in the top of that larch here?
I think that looks like it might in fact be top dieback.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, you can see it with some of the other larch in the area that have been infected with the needle cast, that the tops had reflushed and they're green. So the fact that we're looking at that one down there and it's completely brown, I'm going to guess that that one did succumb.
Okay. But that will not necessarily kill that tree, because the lower part of the tree is still pretty green. Doesn't look like it's as infected down below. Will this fungal infection get worse as the summer goes on, or should it get better?
Well, the needles were infected in the spring, so what we're seeing right now is basically going to be the end of the infection for the larch this season. They might turn a little bit darker as we get closer to fall, but this is going to be the extent of damage for this year. There are some needle casts that affect pine that you might see reinfecting pine in the fall, but because larch lose their needles, that won't happen here. Okay, so we noticed in this ponderosa pine that several of the tips were dead. And looking at it from afar, my first two thoughts were it's probably going to be either western pine shoot borer, or it was going to be Diplodia tip light, which is a fungus. And we looked up closely at this branch tip, and you can see when we took it off that the inside is full of frass. So that tells us that we have western pine shoot borer. There we go. So you can see this is where the insect had been feeding, and the frass is just a combination of the wood and also the poop that's released from the larvae as it's moving through the branch. So the tips have been killed, and this is really common in young stands of ponderosa pine. They love these young tips. And basically, you know, the tree's going to be fine. It's not going to kill the tree. Sometimes you'll get them in the leader, so you can get some strange looking growth forms if the leader is killed, but otherwise the tree will survive. Diplodia tip blight does a similar sort of damage, and you often see this, especially in mature ponderosa pine stands. And if this had been Diplodia, we would have been able to see small round spores, small round black spores on the needles when we pulled this off. And you can see that there are no spores on this piece. So, and Diplodia as well is not necessarily a tree killer. It's just going to kill some of the tips. It is possible for Diplodia to kill a tree, especially if there's a large infection, because as these tips die, the tree can slowly succumb over time. And it would take many years for the tree to die due to Diplodia, but it's unlikely for a young tree to die from western pine shoot borer, because once the tree begins to mature more, they're not going to attack and infest the tree. So this is probably going to happen for a few years, and then it will pass.
You know, Melissa, as you were talking about the possibility that the crown or the lead shoot could die back, it looks almost like that might have happened, because we do actually have a new leader that has taken over, because the one in the what had been the leader looks like it had died back before.
Right, yes, it does. If you look at it, you can see that this is the second leader. So likely the western pine shoot borer had killed the initial leader out. And you can see, because the tree's pretty young, that the form hasn't really been greatly affected in this case, so that's great.
Trees, they'll find a way. All right, so when I was out here earlier this spring, I just happened to be out looking at the intersection between our property and the DNR property, and I happened to come across this unusual looking formation, and I remembered my dad telling me that there was a certain type of fungus that created these fruiting bodies that looked like cow patties. And so I picked it up because I thought it was interesting. And while we have the opportunity to have Melissa explain what this is and the kind of forest it is most commonly found in, I will let her tell you about the particular fungal agent that created this fruiting body. So, Melissa.
So it's called Schweinitzii root and butt rot. And it's commonly called the velvet fungus or the cow pie fungus for obvious reasons. And it affects mostly Douglas fir, although it can affect other species such as western red cedar and lodgepole pine. And we often see the cow pie fungus in old growth stands, and you can see right here we have some very old and large Douglas fir, or at least large for the east side. And Patti had found it underneath this dead Douglas fir. So it is likely that this Douglas fir, this older Douglas fir right here, is probably infected with this root and butt disease. And you can even see when you look up at the crown of the tree that it is producing a lot of cones, a large cone crop. So it might be a little bit stressed out due to this fungus. But yes, it's not a root rot that's similar to Armillaria or Nosis. It's not quite as virulent, but yes, in these older stands, it is usually present, and it can be, it can really affect a Douglas fir stand, an old Douglas fir stand, when it's present, and cause a lot of mortality. So when I began working for the DNR 6 years ago, one of the first things I noticed was how bad the western red cedar looked in eastern Washington. And we began discussing western red cedar and what looked like a decline amongst the pathologists and entomologists in the region. And what we're looking at are western red cedar with thinning crowns. They're discolored. In some cases they look yellow, in other cases they look brown. A lot of cones, so a stress cone crop. Then we'll begin to see mortality of branches. Sometimes it's the top that dies, and eventually complete mortality of the tree. And this is occurring in everything from saplings on up to mature trees. So it seems to be an issue that's affecting the species range-wide. And in our discussions, we've decided that it's probably not a biotic issue. So we're not seeing insects attacking all of these trees. We're not seeing issues with fungus, especially root disease in all of these trees. So it's likely an abiotic issue, something to do with temperature or precipitation, water availability. But we don't have any answers, and we're not really sure how we should manage this problem right now. We do have a project that we put together, and it's going to involve Washington, Oregon, Canada, Idaho, Montana, and we're looking at the issue to try to determine exactly what is causing it and what we can do. So it's going to take a while before we have answers for landowners, but in some cases it might be worth removing western red cedar from your stand if it looks like it's going to die. But I wouldn't eradicate it just yet. I think that we need to allow these trees to potentially recover. We will need these trees for a potential seed source in the future. So western red cedar in general does not like to be thinned out. So if you're thinning a western red cedar stand, I would try to keep it a little bit more tight than you would normally keep like a ponderosa pine stand, for instance. When you thin western red cedar, it has a tendency to get sun scald, and that can really affect the scales, and in turn affect photosynthesis and the ability for the tree to recover. And since it's having issues right now, a heavy thinning in a western red cedar stand probably would not be the best decision if you wanted to retain the leaf trees. So for now, not very much information, but we are working on it, and hopefully we will have some answers in the next coming years. Dwarf mistletoe is a parasitic plant that affects many species of conifers. And here we have dwarf mistletoe in Douglas fir. So this plant is basically taking all of its resources from the Douglas fir. And oftentimes when you look at a broom, as we're seeing right here, or on a branch that is malformed due to the mistletoe, you can see the plant itself. And in the case of Douglas fir, it's pretty small and it's green. It will also produce fruits over time, and these fruits are under pressure. So when they burst, they're capable of shooting out 45 feet. So you can get infections from this mistletoe plant out 45 feet in the other Douglas fir that are surrounding the tree. Also, these seeds are sticky, so they will stick to birds and squirrels as they're moving through the stand, and trees can be inoculated that way with the dwarf mistletoe seeds. Once this plant is in a tree, it usually starts to grow systemically inside. Sometimes you don't even see the plant or the fruits. So you can often tell that a tree is infected with mistletoe just by looking at the branch and seeing if it has a swollen area where the mistletoe is growing inside of it. Once it's in the tree, you're not going to be able to eradicate it. There are no treatments for mistletoe. If it's just one branch, you might be able to snip it off before it does grow systemically towards the main stem, but generally you'll never know whether it has already begun to grow into the stem. So very, very hard to eradicate this plant once it's in the stand, and generally it's in most stands, and it does have some sort of value, especially for wildlife. So I'll give it to Randy to talk about the stand.
So
characteristics.
with mistletoe, as a forester, I like my trees to be happy and healthy. So some people look at mistletoe as a negative because it does stress trees. It does affect the growth because it's robbing the tree of its resources. With Doug fir, one thing that's pretty common, it's not happening in this one, which is good. When you have a heavy mistletoe infection down low, you can see top dieback because it's essentially starving the rest of the tree of nutrients where all the mistletoe is growing. And that's pretty common with Doug fir and larch. Sometimes in the ponderosa we don't see the top dieback as much. But there are other benefits and the reasons why some landowners do leave it. Going back to it's very difficult, if not impossible, to eradicate unless you clear cut everything and start it over. And that's usually not the desired goal for most landowners. And so leaving some isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it can kind of depend on what the rest of the stand is like around that infected tree. If you were trying to grow all Douglas fir in here, the mistletoe and the larger trees can infect the smaller trees underneath, and so that's getting back to species diversity, where having a diverse stand and species composition can help with that monoculture effect of everything getting infected with it. With those witches' brooms, one other landowner objective is wildlife habitat, and that's why a lot of landowners don't have a problem with a little bit of mistletoe being on their property, because those brooms are great nesting platforms for squirrels and owls and birds. And so there are pluses and minuses to it. It just depends on landowners' goals and objectives.
Another thing that I probably should mention is when you have these low-hanging witches' brooms, they tend to carry fire up a tree quite easily. They're very pitchy and they're very dense, so they do have a bit of a risk to fire and ladder fuels and pulling fire up into the crowns of trees. So if you have a stand with a lot of these witches' brooms, it might be worthwhile to prune them off. Also, in regards to fire, one of the reasons why we have such issues with dwarf mistletoe in some of our stands in eastern Washington is because there has been a lack of fire. A lot of in the historical stands in eastern Washington, a lot of the mistletoe issues have been controlled via fire. So the fire will burn up these low-hanging brooms and basically eradicate that tree in particular from mistletoe infection, because at that point the tree has already outgrown the mistletoe infection, and so the upper part of this crown does not appear to be infected at all. So the fire would come through, burn that broom, and then you lose the mistletoe from that tree. And since we have been keeping fire out of stands, we've had a lot of issues with dwarf mistletoe, particularly in areas where we're actually actively managing stands with the DNR. I mean, we're leaving 6 trees per acre infested with mistletoe, and this will rain down on the regeneration that's coming in, and then we have these stands with lots and lots of mistletoe. So prescribed burning would be a really good tool to use if you have a large dwarf mistletoe issue in your stand.
Melissa, is there a certain size of tree? Does the small regeneration of any mistletoe, whether it's larch mistletoe or Doug fir mistletoe, does the young regeneration tree have to achieve a certain size before the plant can actually infect and start growing? Because
No.
we've not seen it in our young plantations.
No, it will get into seedlings. I've seen that, especially in ponderosa pine. And often I think part of what the problem is with seeing it in seedlings and saplings is that it hasn't fruited or it hasn't produced plants yet. And I have a larch in my stand. It's a sapling at this point, and I thought maybe it had escaped dwarf mistletoe infection, but I can see the branches starting to bend in a few places, and I know that the dwarf mistletoe is in there already, even though we don't have any brooms yet and we don't have any plants coming out. So it tends to get infected and grow systemically for a while before you know. So it's possible it escaped infection, but it's also possible that it's growing in there unknowingly. It's hard. hard to see.
And one thing with a lot of the mistletoe plants is it's a relatively long life cycle before you can start to see it producing the fruit in the plant. It could be 3 to 5 years for some species. Another thing is you think of surface area, the leaf surface area. A small tree is going to have a lot smaller surface area, and so the seeds raining down, 1 in 1,000 might hit one, but a lot of them, once they hit the dirt, they're not going to impact the tree. So that's another thing with smaller trees, why you may not see it as much until they get more leaf mass out there to catch more of those seeds.
So I will just add the landowner perspective of mistletoe. We actually do keep mistletoe in our stands for the wildlife habitat that it provides. As Randy said, it's a great food source for grouse. We've had flying squirrels nest in them. We've had owls nesting in them, hawks nesting in these mistletoe brooms. And I have not, as I just mentioned, had not seen very much in our young plantations of real strong infections. So we feel it's a trade-off for us, and it's a valuable trade-off. We have this long-lived wildlife habitat, and as long as that mistletoe grows, it's offering wildlife habitat every year. And yes, we do see some commercial implications as far as value of that timber if we are going to cut it, but we do stewardship. That's what small forest landowners do. So we see the value of leaving it as opposed to trying to eradicate it. That doesn't mean we don't try and reduce the footprint. We do have stands where we have actually had very heavy mistletoe. And so when we're looking at what our next tree species is going to be, we may leave Douglas fir mistletoe because we know we're coming back in and we're going to be planting larch, for instance, or ponderosa pine, and the risk of infection from one type of mistletoe is pretty low into a different species. So here on Rafter 7, we kind of try and keep that balance between wildlife habitat and commercially growing timber. So, thank you.